Good afternoon, everybody. Admiral Kraft and NWDC, thank you for inviting me to be here today. Who am I? What are we going to talk about today? We've heard a lot about innovation. We've heard a lot of great stories from people who have experience, from people who have systems on how we're going to make innovation work. I don't have any of that. I'm just here to tell you guys all a story today. Next slide, please. So, I'm just a sailor like you guys, okay? Maybe I'm a little bit older than a lot of the folks here in the audience, but I'm interested in making my service more combat effective, making my service better at what we do. I happen to have studied a little bit of history, and I've got a story to tell you today about a guy who made a difference when he was a lieutenant. And he changed the face of naval warfare across the world as a lieutenant in the United States Navy. Next slide, please. So this is Vice Admiral William Soudan Sims. Vice Admiral Sims, look at that great beard. He wasn't always a Vice Admiral. And in 1900, he was a lieutenant. He was a lieutenant who had just finished up a short tour in Europe, where he'd been an intelligence officer. And he had studied dreadnought battleships as they were introduced in Europe. And he had studied gunnery practices of both our potential allies and our potential adversaries alike. And so in 1900, it was time for sea duty again, and he got orders to China Station. He was ordered to the USS Kentucky. USS Kentucky was the United States Navy's newest and most powerful battleship. And so he joined Kentucky on deployment. Next slide. Here's a picture of the Kentucky not long after she was launched. It was one of the very first dreadnought-era battleships the United States Navy had. Now he arrived, checked on board, and realized that Kentucky might have been the newest battleship, but it certainly wasn't powerful. There were a lot of problems with this ship and its design. The armor on the ship was below the waterline only. So torpedoes, great. Mines, great. Shells from another battleship, you're out of luck. The turrets were so low when she was fully loaded that if she took a heavy sea, water would pour in through the gun turrets. And also the magazines were not separated in any way from the gun turrets or the weather decks themselves. So a hit from a shell from an enemy battleship was going to penetrate right into the magazines. Now Sims was incensed. He had studied these kinds of ships in his last job, and he knew that this was wrong in every sense of the word. And he wrote a letter to a friend of his who was a fellow naval officer. Next slide. He said, "The Kentucky is not a battleship at all. She's the worst crime in naval construction ever perpetrated by the white race." He was a guy who kind of had strong opinions. Now, Sims knew that this needed to be fixed, but he also knew that he was not going to change the design of a ship while he was on deployment on China Station. You know, changing the technology is great, and instituting new technology is awesome. But that doesn't help us when we're out there on the pointy end, necessarily. So he decided to start focusing on what it was the ship did. He earned his qualifications, he started standing his bridge watches, and he started to study the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs as we call them today. And he wanted to figure out a way to make this ship more combat effective, to try and hide the fact that the design wasn't necessarily the best that was out there. So he's steaming through the South China Sea, visiting cities in China, in the Pacific, and he's looking for a way to make his ship better, when he meets an officer from the Royal Navy. Next slide, please. So at the time, in 1900, Percy Scott was a captain. He had not made admiral yet. And he was the commanding officer of the HMS Terrible. Now, Percy Scott was a little bit of a pariah in the Royal Navy. He didn't have a whole lot of friends. He didn't make a whole lot of friends. And the reason he was on China Station in the Terrible was he had a running feud with an admiral who happened to be on shore duty back in the home islands. And China was as far away as you could get from England. So Percy Scott had developed something called continuous aim fire. What he had done was he'd watched his gunners work their guns, and he realized that there was a better way to shoot. Now we'll talk about gunnery here at the turn of the century for a second. It really hadn't changed in over a century. the techniques they were using were pretty much the same as the ones they used on Constitution in the War of 1812 when they battled British frigates. The gun director would guess how far away the enemy ship was, he'd change the elevation on his gun, and then he'd try and time the roll of the ship to fire the projectile towards the enemy. And each time the ship rolled, he fired again, hoping to hit. Now, guns had become rifled, and so they had greater range. We'd gone to breech loaders, so they were easier to load. They were more powerful, they were bigger, but accuracy really hadn't changed in centuries in naval warfare. So what Percy Scott did was he changed the gearing on his elevation gear, and he made it so the gun director could constantly be changing the barrel of the gun. He added a telescopic sight so that the gun director, while constantly keeping his gun moving, could constantly have it trained on the enemy ship. Now, the gun crews could fire as fast as they could load. It didn't rely on the rolling of the ship, and TTPs changed entirely based on this continuous aim fire. Next slide. So Sims watched the terrible conduct gunnery practice from the deck of the Kentucky. Here you can see the forward gun turret on Kentucky. He saw that the rate of fire increased by 4-fold. The accuracy increased to the point that compared to other ships, the gun crews had a 1,000% increase in effectiveness on the Terrible. Sims looked at this and realized that a single ship using continuous aim fire could take on a squadron of ships that wasn't and win. This would change everything. So Sims, having been a good intelligence officer, wrote a report, and he sent it home to the Bureau of Ordnance. He then went and met Percy Scott, and he befriended him. They were both men of strong opinions, and they kind of took to each other immediately. And he learned exactly how Scott had re-geared the guns. And he learned exactly the methods that he was using. He brought those back to Kentucky, and he started doing the same thing on Kentucky. It didn't take long, and the gun crews on Kentucky were matching the fire rates and accuracy of HMS Terrible. This could easily be done. All we had to do was do it. He wrote another sequence of reports detailing exactly how he would change the American guns, exactly how you would man the gun crews, exactly how you would conduct the new TTPs, and he sent that off to the Bureau. And he waited. And he waited. And he waited. Next slide. So the Bureau of Ordnance was at the Washington Navy Yard. And kind of think, comparison today, kind of think NAVAIR and NAVC, okay? The Bureau of Ordnance had developed the techniques that American battleships used. They had designed and built the guns that were mounted on American battleships. And we all know that American sailors and American technology are the best in the world, and that's the answer. So the Bureau of Ordnance read these reports from this crazy lieutenant on China Station and said, nah, there's no way. They put him in a file cabinet. He sent another report, the second one. They read that one also. Sounds like the same thing. He can't possibly know what he's talking about. They put it in the same file cabinet. It's in the basement of one of the buildings at the Navy Yard. Now, whether or not Sims was right never really crossed anybody's mind. The implications of this really wasn't the interest of the staff there in the Bureau of Ordnance at the Washington Navy Yard. They were looking at their next fit rep cycle. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to take a break here from the story for a second. Now, recently there's been a lot of study into innovation and creativity. And Jonah Lehrer here wrote a book called Imagine, and it's all about creativity and the scientists that are studying how creativity works. And Lehrer writes in his books that researchers have discovered that the ability to stick with it, the technical name of this trait is grit, is one of the most important predictors of success in creativity. So whether we're talking about Bob Dylan taking a year to get a song just right before it becomes a famous classic that we all know, or whether you're talking about J.K. Rowling sending her book about a crazy wizard school to 19 different publishers over years before it was finally accepted and we all got to read Harry Potter, it's that stick-to-itness, that grit, that never give up. that again and again and again shows up in successful innovation. Next slide. So here's William Sims with his wardroom mates on Kentucky, and he continued to work. He used his wardroom mates to help him study this problem, and he continued to write reports. He knew that he was being ignored. He kept sending them home, and it didn't matter. He didn't hear a peep. He kept sending them home, and the expert staff back at the Bureau didn't even respond. He wrote to a friend and a fellow officer, next slide, to talk about his frustration. He wrote that with every fiber of my being, I loathe indirection and shiftiness. And where it occurs in high place and is used to save face at the expense of the vital interests of our great service, in which silly people place such childlike trust, I want that man's blood, and I'll have it no matter what it costs me personally. Now, Sims didn't really seem to have, while he respected rank, it didn't mean that you automatically got a pass from Sims. So Sims started writing more reports, and this time he changed the language in them. And he started adding the implications of, hey, we'll lose a naval battle if we don't use this. Hey, if our fleet is decimated and the coasts are open to invasion, the War of 1812 British invasion that burned Washington will just be the beginning. Next slide. Now, I'd say William Southern Sims had true grit. He wrote 13 reports over the span of 2 years. He circulated them amongst the captains of all the battleships throughout the fleet because the Bureau was ignoring him. And he got his own CO and the squadron commodore on the Asiatic station to endorse his reports because they saw what Kentucky was accomplishing. Now, word spread throughout the fleet. And they started asking the Bureau of Ordnance, what is the deal with this continuous aim fire? Why are we not using this? So the Bureau of Ordnance decided, next slide, that they were going to conduct a test. So they set up a gun on the beach at the Washington Navy Yard, and they conducted a test. And they wrote their report afterwards, and their report said that continuous aim fire was a mathematical impossibility. The lieutenant on China Station doesn't understand physics, and it can't be happening. Now, they designed a system and a test that did not make any of the modifications to the gun that Sims required. And they conducted the test on shore for a TTP for a ship that was rolling in heavy seas. But their report went out, and they said it was impossible. And belief in Sims and his system evaporated in the fleet overnight. The Bureau of Ordnance says this can't be done. Sims, after 13 reports in 2 years, had had enough. And he did something that he would later characterize as maybe a mistake. Next slide. He called what he did the rankest kind of insubordination. He wrote a letter to the President of the United States. Next slide. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, had once been Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt. And he was a navalist by every definition of the word. He had written the Naval War of 1812, which even to this day is one of the seminal history works of the War of 1812. He was personal friends with Alfred Thayer Mahan, who invented the term sea power. He would later invent the Great White Fleet and send it around the world. And presidents, over a century ago, actually sometimes read letters sent to them from lieutenants on China Station. And he read the letter, and he thought it was insane. If it's true, it changes everything. And he sent word back to China Station that Lieutenant Sims was to return to the United States. He didn't believe him, but he recognized that it might be a problem. So he instituted a test. He sent the Atlantic Fleet out to sea. 5 ships were to be involved in the test. Each ship got 5 minutes to fire as fast as they could at a light ship that was basically a target, about a mile distant, and then they'd see how the gunnery went. After 25 minutes of firing on the hulk of the light ship, 2 shells had penetrated the sails of this ship. Not a single shell had hit the hull or any of the superstructure after 25 minutes of firing by American battleships. Obviously, there was a problem.